Hello everyone and welcome to today's Sutta class. We will start as usual with the Namo Tassa. Feel free to join if you like. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ Dhammaṃ Sanghaṃ Namasami. So, hello and welcome everyone to today's Sutta class. Today we will continue reading the Dantabhūmi Sutta. This is Majjhima Nikaya number 125. And we already spent the last 2 weeks, reading this sutta. And so in this sutta, it talks about the simile of an elephant. So the simile actually of taming an elephant. So in the same way that people in the Buddha's time used to tame wild elephants to make them fit for service and to do various works for humans, in the same way we are trying to tame our mind in order to become an arahant. So in the same way that there are many stages that elephants have to go through to become tamed, in the same way there's a whole gradual training, a whole gradual path of various different practices that build up on each other and that we can go through when we undertake Buddhist practice. And so basically the idea is that in the beginning the elephant is entirely wild, it is stuck in the jungle, and then over time it gets used to humans and undergoes various trainings. In the same way our mind obviously in the beginning is entirely wild and it is stuck in this jungle of defilements in our mind. And so over time we are trying to detach it from that jungle, from all these wild thoughts and all these defilements and all these hindrances, and sort of make it more clear, more pure, until finally we let go of all attachments and become arahants. So this sutta then is about the gradual training. And last time we already started reading the part where the gradual training begins. And what we did is we also compared this to two other suttas, because obviously the gradual training is explained in many other places in the suttas. And especially there are two, like it's not explained in exactly the same way all the time, but there are several sort of outlines or several models that are found all over the suttas. And two that are very popular, very widespread, and that we find all over the place are the ones that are found in the Maha-Asapura Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya number 39, and the Chula-Hathipadopama Sutta, so Majjhima Nikaya number 27. So we compare the gradual training in this sutta that we are reading today with those other two. And as we will see today, the gradual training as it is found in this sutta that we are reading now is quite special, quite unique in some parts. And that's very interesting to compare those parts to how it is usually explained, because I think it does shed some light on a few issues that are discussed and debated quite a bit in Buddhist circles about how we train and how certain things are to be understood. And so having this additional perspective that we get from this sutta here, Dantabhūmi Sutta, can be quite interesting to compare with the way it is usually explained. So last time we read the beginning stages of the gradual training. Of course, the gradual training starts with the Buddha arising in the world and making the Dhamma available. So without the Dhamma being taught, obviously there is no gradual training. And without the Sangha being founded, there is no way of going forth and actually dedicating one's life to the practice fully, much more fully than people could usually do in lay life. So that was the beginning stage, the first step, the Buddha being there, founding the Sangha, teaching the Dhamma. And then for people getting inspired and then deciding that they also want to dedicate their life to practice. And then once they have actually made this decision to dedicate their life to practice, in this sutta here, or usually in the gradual training, that means that they go forth, that they become monastics, monks or nuns. And then the first few steps on the path is the training in sila, so training in ethics or in morality. And that can be described in different ways. We talked about it in quite a bit of detail last time. We compared the different versions from the Mahāsapura Sutta, the Chulahatipatupama Sutta, and this sutta that we are reading here. And we saw there was some variance, but generally I think it's quite clear what ethical behavior means in Buddhism, what wholesome and unwholesome behavior is, keeping the precepts, not killing, not stealing, not lying, no sexual misconduct and such things. Of course, for monks and nuns, it's a lot more detailed. There are a lot more rules, a lot more precepts. But generally, like the basics of sila are quite well understood. And so we talked about this last time quite a bit. And then the next step in the gradual path that is found in all versions, no matter which sutta we are reading, is sense restraint. So guarding the doors of our sense faculties, the six senses, the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind, so that we don't constantly get distracted, so that we don't constantly get triggered by the things of the world, and our mindfulness is destroyed, and our defilements are constantly being fed and made stronger. And of course, then our mind gets more and more confused and less clear, less pure, and less able to actually develop on the Buddhist path. So for that reason, sense restraint is very essential, and it becomes very early on the gradual training path, because this is really one of the basics that is very, very essential for any kind of Buddhist practitioner, whether that's a monastic or a lay person. So being in an environment that is fairly clear, fairly calm, and doesn't have too many distractions, not too many triggers to feed into our defilements is very essential if we are serious about practice and if we want to develop our path to a somewhat higher level. And then the next step on the gradual training that we also had a look at last time was moderation in eating. So not eating too much, and also it was suggested to not eat in the evening here. Of course, that is one of the 8 precepts. So if we want to sort of take our practice to a somewhat higher level, we can take 8 precepts and then abstain from eating in the evening. This can be very helpful because food is obviously one of the major attachments that we have. We like to eat good food. We like to eat things that are tasty, that we like, things from our culture. So food is something that is very specific to different cultures, and people feel very proud of their traditions. And it's really something that people build identity on. Like, this is our traditional food. This is what my mother used to cook, or something like this. So people have a lot of identification around food, and for that reason, that is also one of fairly basic and fundamental trainings, not to be too much attached to this. And of course, food usually goes along with socializing. So often families will come together to have meals together, communities will eat together. So it's not just about the attachment to the taste itself, but it's also the attachment to socializing, to big groups, to a lot of sort of somewhat pointless talk that goes on during mealtime conversations. So all this socializing can also be quite distracting from practice. And so that is also one of the fairly early stages on the path to somewhat minimize that kind of practices. And so this is where we stopped last time, and where we will pick up today with the next step, that is wakefulness. So practicing with reducing the amount of sleep. And I have put a link in the live chat to Bhante Sujato's translation. I myself will continue to read from Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation. For those of you who want to read along, this is paragraph 18 in his translation, if you have the book. Otherwise, obviously, you can read along in Bhante Sujato's translation. The problem, though, is that because this is the gradual training, and the gradual training is found in many different suttas, Bhante Sujato's translation is quite abridged, and the next few paragraphs, I think, are not actually found on Sutta Central. So if you want to read along, you can't really read along there. So you'll just have to listen to what I'm reading now. But anyway, let's get started with the sutta for today. And so the Buddha says the following. When Agivesana, the noble disciple, is moderate in eating, then the Tathagata disciplines them further. Come, bhikkhu, come, monastic, come, practitioner. Be devoted to wakefulness. During the day, while walking back and forth and sitting, purify your mind of obstructive states. In the first watch of the night, while walking back and forth and sitting, purify your mind of obstructive states. In the middle watch of the night, you should lie down on the right side in the lion's pose, with one foot overlapping the other, mindful and fully aware, after noting in your mind the time for rising. After rising in the last watch of the night, while walking back and forth and sitting, purify your mind of obstructive states. So this is the next step, devotion to wakefulness. And of course, attachment to sleep is one of the other main defilements that a lot of people experience, apart from food that we talked about just now. This attachment to sleep is quite popular. Everybody likes to lie down to have a nap. And I think many people know that it's difficult to get up in the morning. We like to lie in bed. It's nice and warm and cozy, and our mind is in this really kind of relaxed state, somewhere in between really being awake and being asleep. And we want to prolong this sort of hazy, foggy mind state for as long as we can and try to fall asleep again and sort of roll over again and really can't bring ourselves to get up. So this is what the Buddha is talking about here. This sort of dwelling in this kind of hazy, foggy state that is not mindful, that is not clear, and where the defilements have free reign because we don't really know what we're doing. And obviously that is not very helpful on the path. In fact, it's counterproductive. So this is really something that we should practice with and try to overcome the attachment to lying in bed, rolling over again, not wanting to get up, wanting to enjoy the warm, cozy, foggy, hazy mind states, the warm, cozy bed and the foggy, hazy mind states. And so obviously this isn't helpful at all for practice. And so back in the Buddha's time, obviously they had a similar, like they divided the day in a similar way than we do nowadays. So half a day, like 12 hours is the daytime, 12 hours is the nighttime. And then each of these two periods is divided into 3 portions. So there is a first watch of the night, a middle watch of the night, and a last watch of the night. And each of these 3 portions is 4 hours. And so obviously during daytime, the Buddha says you should be devoted to wakefulness. You shouldn't have a nap in the middle of the day. There's no siesta if you want to really seriously practice. So during the day, you should really devote yourself to your practice. You can do sitting meditation, you can do walking meditation, you can do all the other things that you need to do in the day. As long as you're awake and you're mindful, you're trying to be present and aware of what you're doing. And basically, the Buddha says, whatever you do during the day, you try to purify your mind of obstructive states. So even while you're doing something else, maybe you have to work, maybe you have to do some chores, maybe you're engaging in other things, kind of keep an eye on your mind, see what's happening there. And if the mind is full of greed or full of ill will or something, then try to let that go, try to purify that. So you don't have to be in formal meditation, obviously, the whole day. Obviously, everybody has to do other stuff from time to time. But sort of being aware and mindful enough to notice what's going on. And if too much unwholesome stuff goes on in the mind, then just stop what you're doing and try to let that go and try to establish a more helpful, beneficial, wholesome mind instead of being on autopilot the whole time and not really noticing what's happening in the mind. And then, of course, at nighttime, supposed to be quite similar. So as I mentioned, the night period is also 12 hours, but this is not 12 hours just for sleeping. The first 4 hours of the night period, so the first watch of the night, you still continue with your practice. You don't lie down to sleep. Buddha suggests that you still do walking and sitting meditation. And of course, even if you don't do walking and sitting meditation, even if you do other things, for example, in the Buddha's time, it was quite common that monastics would visit each other in the evening to hear Dhamma talks or to ask each other questions. So doing other wholesome activities, but still keeping an eye on the mind and trying to purify the mind of those hindrances. And then the middle period of the night is the time when we actually lie down to sleep. But even then, when we lie down, we still try to be mindful while we fall asleep, so we don't just let our mind go wild and let all the defilements loose and let them run around and run wild in our head, because then we'll have a very sort of restless sleep. We can have a lot of wild dreams. We can wake up and feel still very tired. So one practice that the Buddha suggested elsewhere was to do metta practice, metta meditation before we fall asleep, because that leads to a calm and peaceful sleep and good dreams. So that is one thing that people can try who experience a lot of nightmares or who have trouble falling asleep. So the Buddha suggests that we try to be mindful whenever we can. So until the last moment before we fall asleep, we try to be mindful. And obviously when we wake up again, so that would be in the last watch of the night, the last 4 hours of the night, then not to turn over, not to pull the blanket over our head again and try to fall asleep again, but to really, once we wake up, to re-establish mindfulness and to bring up the energy and to devote ourselves to practice again. So really trying to cut off this desire to be lazy and sleepy. Obviously, sloth and torpor, we all know this is one of the hindrances, and that is the hindrance that can overcome us very easily when we lie in bed. And so this is what the Buddha wants to address with this kind of practice. This is what is called devotion to wakefulness. And so this practice is found not only in the sutta here that we are reading, the Dantabhūmi Sutta. This is also found in the other versions of the gradual training, especially in the Mahāsapura Sutta. It is found in exactly the same way with exactly the same phrasing as it is found here. In the Chulahatipadopama Sutta, this paragraph is not found. So not all versions of the gradual training mention this part. But I think it is clear overall from the suttas that that is quite an important step. And obviously, many suttas talk about the hindrance of sloth and torpor. So we know that this is something to work with and to try to overcome. So, and then once we are somewhat proficient with this, we can move on to the next step on the gradual training. And then next step is what in modern times we call mindfulness in daily life. And there the Buddha says the following. When Agivesana, the noble disciple, or as we talked about last time, the disciple of the noble ones, is devoted to wakefulness, then the Tathagata disciplines them further. Come, monastic, come, practitioner, be possessed of mindfulness and full awareness. Act in full awareness when going forward and returning. Act in full awareness when looking ahead and looking away. Act in full awareness when flexing and extending your limbs. When wearing your robes and carrying your outer robe and bowl. When eating, drinking, consuming food and tasting. When defecating and urinating. When walking, standing, sitting, falling asleep, waking up, talking and keeping silent. So here we have a whole list of various day-to-day activities. So obviously this is not necessarily talking about meditation practice. This is just talking about our daily life, when we walk around, when we engage in different tasks, when you have different things to do. So obviously this talks from the point of view of a monastic. So a monastic would go forward and return because they're doing walking meditation, for example, or they put on their robes, they carry their bowl, especially when they go on alms round. So this is obviously a daily task for monastics. Every day they need to go on alms round, otherwise they have no food. And obviously everybody, whether monastic or lay person, has to eat daily. They have to go to the bathroom every day, multiple times. And everybody just walks and does all the different activities that I mentioned here: walking, standing, sitting, falling asleep, waking up, talking with other people, being silent from time to time. And then, as the text here says, moving the limbs and looking around, and just the ordinary day-to-day things that we do. And no matter what we do in our daily life, it's important to maintain mindfulness of what we're doing, as I mentioned before, because we're trying to purify our mind. So it's important to sort of keep watch on what's going on with our mind. The mind states that we have, are they wholesome? Are they unwholesome? Are they beneficial? Are they unbeneficial? Do we have a lot of hindrances, or is the mind fairly calm and equanimous, or filled with one of the Brahma Viharas, such as loving kindness or compassion? So just keeping a general awareness on how we live our life, what kind of mental habits we're cultivating in our daily life. Are we cultivating habits of ill will, of anger? Are we cultivating habits of greed, or of sleepiness, or of restlessness? Or are we actually cultivating habits of kindness, of compassion, of wisdom, of calmness, of peace, of equanimity, and these kind of things? So obviously, this is not something we just do in our meditation practice. This is something we need to do 24 hours a day, as much as we can be mindful. Because obviously, if we try to meditate, some people find time to meditate 5 minutes a day, or 10 minutes a day, or even half an hour. Some very committed practitioners might meditate for several hours every day. But in any case, there are many hours in every day where we don't meditate. Even if you're on a meditation retreat, there will be times when we don't meditate because we have to eat, and we have to shower, and we have to do various other things. So if we don't keep an eye on what the mind is doing during those times, obviously then we can cultivate a lot of unwholesome habits in that time period. So it's just important to try and be mindful of what is going on internally the whole time. And that is what this paragraph here talks about. And one interesting point here in this paragraph also is the mention of mindfulness and full awareness. In Pali, this is called sati and sampajanya. And it might seem like these are two synonyms. They're not quite synonyms. There is a small difference between those two. So mindfulness basically is just being aware of what is going on. And sampajanya, this is related to the word panya, so wisdom, is the evaluation, whether that is wholesome, whether that is unwholesome, and whether that's okay to keep on going like this, or whether we need to change something. So for example, let's say there is a lot of anger in our mind. So mindfulness will only note that there is anger. But if we stop at this point, then we can just note anger, but we don't really come to the conclusion we need to do something about this. We need to replace the anger with loving kindness. And we can just keep on cultivating all this anger while being totally mindful, but we're not having wisdom associated with it. So we also, whenever we practice mindfulness, we need to have the wisdom aspect there as well. So that is sampajanya. The awareness whether that is actually beneficial to keep on going like this, or whether we need to change. And in the example of anger, obviously we should try and change that and replace it with loving kindness, or with compassion, or some other helpful mind state, because obviously we can all very clearly see this is unwholesome, and this is not a habit that we want to cultivate. So that is the difference between sati and sampajanya, or mindfulness and full awareness. And both of them are obviously very important, and both of them should arise together if we want to train and practice the path. So, and then we are moving on to the next step on the path, on this gradual training. And the next step now is to sit down for formal meditation practice. So as you notice, for the time being, we haven't really talked about formal meditation practice too much. The Buddha has suggested various different steps up until now, but he hasn't really talked about actual sitting and walking meditation. So this is now the first time, the next step, where the meditation takes place and where we try to overcome the hindrances. So the next step is overcoming the 5 hindrances. And here the Buddha says, when Agivesana, the noble disciple, possesses mindfulness and full awareness, then the Tathagata disciplines them further. Come, monastic, come, practitioner, resort to a secluded resting place. The forest, the root of a tree, a mountain, a ravine, a hillside cave, a charnel ground, a jungle thicket, an open space, a heap of straw. They resort to a secluded resting place, the forest, the root of a tree, a mountain, a ravine, a hillside cave, a charnel ground, a jungle thicket, an open space, or a heap of straw. On returning from their alms round after their meal, they sit down, folding their legs crosswise, setting their body erect, and establishing mindfulness before them. Abandoning covetousness for the world, they abide with a mind free from covetousness. They purify their mind from covetousness. Abandoning ill will and hatred, they abide with a mind free from ill will, compassionate for the welfare of all living beings. They purify their mind from ill will and hatred. Abandoning sloth and torpor, they abide free from sloth and torpor, recipient of light, mindful and fully aware. They purify their mind from sloth and torpor. Abandoning restlessness and remorse, they abide unagitated with a mind inwardly peaceful. They purify their mind from restlessness and remorse. Abandoning doubt, they abide having gone beyond doubt, unperplexed about wholesome states. They purify their mind from doubt. So now this is the passage where we actually go into seclusion, into a quiet, calm space. There's a whole list of, I think, 9 different possibilities where we can go. A secluded resting place that is far from other people, where we are really alone, where there are not many external distractions out in nature. So where we are not interrupted by other people or by other things that try to capture our attention, our phone, our computer, or whatever, other people that drop by and talk to us, or our family members, or our cat, or our dog, or whatever. We really go to a place where we're not disturbed. So in some other suttas, the Buddha also mentions going to an empty hut. So a quiet room could also be helpful for people who live in the city and who can't just go out into nature and sit under a tree or something. So we go to this calm, quiet, secluded place, because if the environment is calm and quiet, obviously that's also much easier for our mind to quieten down and to become calm. And then Buddha also says we do this after the alms round, so after we have taken our meal, so when we have done all the chores for today, so our mind isn't constantly busy and planning what we need to do later, because we've done everything that we needed to do for the day. So we are free now to just focus on our practice. And then the Buddha says we focus on overcoming the hindrances. So obviously, I think you've all recognized this list is obviously the list of the 5 hindrances. The first one here is called covetousness. Elsewhere, this is called sensual desire. It is called lust or greed. So various synonyms here for this. This is obviously attraction to the sense, the pleasurable object, the sense objects in the world. And this is, for many people, the strongest attachment. And for that reason, this is the first hindrance. And that is why the Buddha deals with this first. So we try to abandon that. Then the next hindrance is that of ill will. That is also a very, very strong hindrance. Sometimes the second strongest. For other people, this can also be by far the strongest hindrance, much stronger than sensual desire. So ill will, this also covers anger, this covers hate, this covers rage, this covers like a whole list of negative mind states. And this is, again, one of the practices that we need, one of the hindrances that we need to overcome. And if you remember, not too long ago, I think only a few weeks ago, we had this series of talks where we focused on each of the hindrances, and we specifically talked about methods, how to overcome all those hindrances. Here in this sutta, the methods are just mentioned very briefly. So for covetousness, they didn't really mention any counteractive measure. How to deal with this, the Buddha just says, well, we deal with it, we abandon it, but he doesn't really explain how. For ill will, the Buddha says we practice compassion. So compassion is one of the antidotes for ill will. Another one is metta practice, loving kindness practice. So Brahma Vihara practice is very powerful and the usual method for overcoming ill will. And then the third hindrance here is sloth and torpor, sometimes also called laziness and sleepiness. Again, we've already talked about this when we talked about devotion to wakefulness. So this is something we try to overcome in our daily life, where with the habits that we cultivate. So not sleeping too much during the day, trying to get up energized in the morning, and not to drag on this state, between sleepiness, between actual sleep and between being awake. And while we are in our meditation, and if we experience sloth and torpor in our meditation practice, then, as we have talked about also a few weeks ago, one of the very powerful methods to deal with this is the perception of light. So that is what the Buddha talks here. Being percipient of light is one of the ways to abide free from sloth and torpor. So because obviously laziness, sleepiness can be especially powerful or can be triggered if the surrounding is too dark, because that signals to our body that it's nighttime, and at nighttime, obviously, we have the tendency to fall asleep. So if we struggle a lot with sloth and torpor, one of the tricks can be to meditate in a room that is well lit, where there's a lot of light, it's very bright, so we don't have the natural tendency to want to fall asleep because we don't perceive this as a night period. For some people, it can also be helpful to look at a candle flame, to look at a window, to look at light bulb. People who have a very strong visualization power can also imagine a light in the mind if there's no other light present. So all these can help to overcome sloth and torpor. The next hindrance, agitation and remorse. This is dealt with by cultivating the perception of peace. So calmness, stillness, these kind of practices. So obviously a mind that is agitated has way too much energy. It is just jumping from one thing to the next, and it doesn't have any peace. So the antidote to restlessness is obviously the perception of peace, the perception of calmness. And especially for restlessness, it is especially important to meditate in a place that is very calm, very peaceful, where there are no distractions, so that the mind doesn't get triggered through the sense doors by outside influences and gets even more agitated. And then the last hindrance is doubt. We've also talked in a lot of detail about doubt. So doubt is not doubt about any random worldly kind of things. This is doubt about the Dhamma practice, doubt about what is wholesome, what is unwholesome, doubt in the Buddha, doubt in the Dhamma, the Sangha, of one's own abilities to practice. And so the countermeasure for doubt is learning, studying, being really clear, as the Buddha says here, being unperplexed about wholesome states, knowing the difference between what is beneficial, what is unbeneficial, and then practicing in that way, and then seeing the benefits for oneself. So these are the 5 hindrances. Those are also mentioned in all versions of the gradual training. In some versions, they are explained with very beautiful similes. So covetousness, for example, is compared with a debt, because when we go into debt, we get money right now, so it seems very pleasurable. But in the long run, we have to pay this back with interest. So the suffering that follows from taking a loan is actually much bigger than the initial positive impact that we had. Then ill will is compared with a disease. Sloth and torpor is compared with a prison. Restlessness and remorse is compared with slavery, and doubt is compared with a road across the desert. We've talked about all these similes in a lot of detail, so I'm not going to go through all this again. But the similes are very, very interesting, and I think they're really very powerful, and they really fit the respective hindrance that they are associated with. So if you're interested, you can go back and listen to those talks again. So depending on which version of the gradual training you read, which sutta you read, there will be those similes associated with it, or they will not be there. There will just be this sort of more technical description that we have read right now. But anyway, this next step, this step of abandoning the hindrances, is found in all versions of the gradual training. And then we move on to the next step, and this next step now is very, very unique only to this sutta here. So this is one of the very interesting points of this sutta, because this point is just so unique, because normally the gradual training is quite standardized, and when you find an instance or a sutta like this one here where something happens that is so out of the ordinary, then I think that is quite noteworthy, and it's quite worth to spend some time looking at this. And so the next step that the Buddha describes here is satipatthana practice. And the Buddha says the following: having thus abandoned these 5 hindrances, imperfections of the mind that weaken wisdom, they abide contemplating the body as a body, ardent, fully aware and mindful, having put away covetousness and grief for the world. They abide contemplating feelings as feelings, mind as mind, and mind objects as mind objects, ardent, fully aware and mindful, having put away covetousness and grief for the world. Just as Akivesana, the elephant tamer, plants a large post in the earth and binds the forest elephant to it by the neck in order to subdue his forest habits and to inculcate in him habits congenial to human beings, so these 4 foundations of mindfulness are the bindings for the mind of the noble disciple, or the disciple of the noble one, in order to subdue his habits, or to subdue their habits based on the household life, to subdue their memories and intentions based on the household life, to subdue their distress, fatigue, and fever based on the household life, and in order that they may attain the true way and realize Nibbana. So, usually in all other versions of the gradual training, at this point in time, once we have overcome the 5 hindrances, the description that follows always is the description of the first jhana. So many of you will be familiar with the stock passage that starts very similar to here: having thus abandoned these 5 hindrances, imperfections of the mind that weaken wisdom. And then usually it continues: quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states, they enter upon and abide in the first jhana, and then follows the list of all the jhana factors, vitaka and vichara, and then piti sukha and unification of mind, chit ekaggata. So this is probably what all of you are familiar with, but this is not what this sutta tells us. This sutta tells us that the next step on the path now, or on the gradual training, is the satipatthana practice. So to do contemplation practices. And obviously satipatthana, we all are familiar. There are 4 satipatthanas, 4 foundations of mindfulness. The first one is the body. The next one is the feelings. After that is the mind. And the last one is here called mind objects, sometimes also translated as phenomena. So these are things that we can cultivate, that we can contemplate, that we can meditate on in order to develop wisdom, also in order to develop samadhi to some extent, and also to understand impermanence. Typically in the Satipatthana Sutta, the sutta that describes Satipatthana practice in a lot of detail, every single practice has a stock passage that tells us we need to contemplate this internally, externally, and internally and externally. We see the arising, we see the cessation again of those phenomena. So one of the main practices of Satipatthana practice also is seeing impermanence, contemplating impermanence, and that is technically or usually more seen as a wisdom practice, a vipassana practice. But we can also develop quite deep samadhi with these kind of contemplations. And I think the Buddha wants to put special emphasis on this factor of the gradual training, because now here he adds on a simile. As we have seen in this whole description of the gradual training up until now, there hasn't been any kind of simile. So this hasn't been tied in with the original simile of how to tame an elephant. But this practice here now has a link that sort of ties in back with the simile of how to tame an elephant, because the Buddha says, well, just as when you tame an elephant, you put that pole there, a very strong pole, and you tie the elephant to it. So in the same way, we tie our mind to the Satipatthana practices so that the mind doesn't run around wildly and run back into the jungle of our defilements. So we use the Satipatthana practices in the same way that we train an elephant. So I think because the simile is attached to this step on the gradual training, I think that Buddha wants to tell us this is of special importance and we really need to pay attention to this. And also because it is so unusual to see Satipatthana practice in this place instead of the first jhana. And then the Buddha continues and he says, then the Tathagata disciplines them further. Come, mendicant, monastic, come, practitioner. Abide contemplating the body as a body, but do not think thoughts of sensual desire. Abide contemplating feelings as feelings, mind as mind objects as mind objects, but do not think thoughts of sensual desire. So now there is a next step, and this next step might seem a little bit strange, because the next step again is just to do Satipatthana practice. So contemplate the body as a body, contemplate feelings and mind objects as mind objects, and so on. So we've just done that, like the previous step. So why is it there again? And why does the Buddha tell us, do not think thoughts of sensual desire? So sensual desire obviously is one of the hindrances. It's the same hindrance as covetousness. So actually, we should have abandoned that hindrance like 2 steps before when we were dealing with the 5 hindrances. So at this point on the gradual path, we should actually already have overcome this. So why does the Buddha mention this here? And it is a little bit strange. So, but the interesting thing is that actually in Pali, there are variant readings. So, and one of the variant readings doesn't actually say think thoughts of sensual desire. One of the variant readings says, do not think thoughts that are connected with the body, do not think thoughts that are connected with the feelings, with the mind, and with the mind objects. So obviously, if we do contemplations based on Satipatthana practice, then especially in the beginning stages of the contemplations can be very active. We do think thoughts still. Obviously not random thoughts, not thoughts that are connected with the 5 hindrances, but thoughts that are focused on the meditation object. But eventually, as we go deeper into practice, we want to let go of those thoughts and we want to go into very deep samadhi. So obviously in very deep samadhi, we don't have thoughts anymore. So then it does make, actually this next step does make sense. So we're still based on the Satipatthana, we're now training in order to let go of our thinking mind. So the thinking that is still connected with those 4 Satipatthana objects, we are now letting go. And if we adopt this variant reading in the Pali, then we can actually say this next step here makes sense. And now we are trying to overcome the thoughts and go into deeper samadhi. So I think it might be quite beneficial actually to go with that variant reading, because then here this sutta makes a bit more sense. And then actually it is quite interesting. And then we move on to the next step on the gradual training. And now the Buddha says, with the stilling of applied and sustained thoughts, they enter upon and abide in the 2nd jhana. the third jhana, and the fourth jhana. So you may notice that this is like really strange because we haven't really talked about the first jhana yet. As I mentioned, in place of where usually we find the first jhana in every other version of the graduate training, here we find satipatthana practice. But from satipatthana practice, then we overcome thoughts, and then we move straight into the second jhana. So the Buddha doesn't talk about the first jhana here at all. So of course, some people have said the sutta is corrupted and the passage about the first jhana was lost. Of course, that is possible. We don't know. But usually these kind of stock passages don't get lost, because if they were there originally, other people would have noticed that they get lost, because it's so standard that if somebody makes a mistake with a standard passage, everybody else will notice and will point it out. So it's more likely that actually right from the beginning, this first jhana was never there. And instead of the first jhana, there was this practice of satipatthana. And so it is possible that the Buddha intended to give us an alternative description for the first jhana that is not the usual stock passage, that is actually based on satipatthana practices. And I think this has very, very interesting implications on many of the discussions that are going on nowadays. So one of the discussions that we have about jhana practice that I think many of you are familiar with is the question, can the body still be felt in jhana, or can the body not be felt in jhana? And one of the other questions that we discuss a lot, especially with regard to the first jhana, is what does vitakka and vichara mean? So some people translate this as thinking and pondering. Other people translate this as applied and sustained thought. Other people translate this as placing the mind and keeping it connected. And those people say that there is no thought in jhana at all. But here clearly in this passage that the Buddha goes through here, while he explains satipatthana practice and so on, thinking is still there. For these contemplation practices, we need thinking. And then the next step here, as we have seen, is to overcome all those thoughts and then enter the second jhana. So if this is actually intended by the Buddha to be an alternative description of the first jhana, because otherwise we couldn't straight go into the second jhana from there, then it seems quite likely that at least in some forms of the first jhana, we can still have thoughts, obviously not random thoughts, again, not thoughts that are in any way connected with the five hindrances, but thoughts that are directed at the meditation object, at the various satipatthana practices. So for that reason, I think this sutta here is very, very interesting. And I see that time is already a little bit advanced, but I think this was like the main interesting part of this sutta. So I really wanted to spend some time discussing this part because it's so unusual and because it's not found in any other version of the graduate training. So I'll just keep on going a little bit more because I don't see any question in the live chat. So if you have questions, please post them. But for now, since we have a few minutes left, I will just keep on going and finish off this sutta. So the next step here is a passage that is extremely abridged. So let's just read through that. The Buddha says, when they have gone through the next jhanas, the second, the third, and the fourth jhana, then the next step is when their concentrated mind is thus purified, and there's a whole stock passage there that says bright, unblemished, rid of imperfection, malleable, wieldy, steady, and attained to imperturbability. And then there's a whole paragraph that is missing here that talks about recollection of past lives. Then there is an entire paragraph that is also missing here that is sort of abbreviated here with a reference to another sutta that talks about the recollection, or that talks about the understanding of karma and rebirth, how good acts lead to a good rebirth, how bad acts lead to a bad rebirth. And then finally, there is a third paragraph that is almost missing here that talks about how we make the breakthrough to arahantship, how we understand as it actually is all of the Four Noble Truths, and how we understand as it actually is the letting go of all the taints and all the defilements in the mind, so the mind becomes entirely purified and clear and pure. And at that point, we understand that we have become arahants. And that is, all of that is abridged here, all of that is left out. The only thing that is mentioned here in Bhikkhu Bodhi's version is they understand birth is destroyed, the holy life has been lived, what had to be done has been done, and there is no more coming to any state of being. So obviously that is the standard stock passage of arahantship. And those paragraphs that have been left out here, those are standard stock passages found in all of the other versions of the gradual training, sometimes with similes, sometimes without similes, but the stock passages are the same everywhere. So since time is already a little bit advanced, we don't have to go through that now. But I see that a lot of people have typed something in the chat. So maybe we'll finish here for today. And I will just have a brief look at the questions. So Gita says, thank you. Hello, Gita. Nice to see you. Good to see that you have time to join in again. It's very nice. Miriam says that she's very triggered. She here, I'm not sure. They are quite triggered by noises since they became more sensitive after practicing. That's kind of a common state, I think, in meditation practice. Sometimes it can be helpful to retreat for a while into an actually quiet place, such as going on retreat. And the other thing is then just to practice equanimity. If you cannot retreat to a quiet place, just to practice equanimity with the noises and try to focus on your attention on another meditation object. Yeah, the question is good to follow the longing. So as I mentioned, if you can, obviously that's helpful. If you cannot, then it's always good to practice metta. Metta can be very powerful. It can also be powerful to shift your focus of attention to another meditation object, not to pay attention to all those noises. Can also be helpful to practice equanimity with the noises. So just try out a few different things and see how you go. And Anagarika Sunya says, these days there seems to be much variation in the emphasis on literal wakefulness, sleeping only 4 hours per night. Is there justification for a more liberal interpretation of wakefulness? So I think 4 hours at night, I think, shouldn't be taken too literal, especially in a modern setting where our minds are really very busy during the day and therefore they get very exhausted and very fatigued. So sleeping 4 hours at night isn't really attainable or isn't really realistic, even for many monastics, because even monastic life nowadays is much more busy than it was in the Buddha's time, let alone for lay people that still have to work and still have to manage a lot of different responsibilities. So the main practice, I think, is not to overindulge in sleep. As I mentioned in the beginning, like if you already woke up, then really get up, try to energize yourself, try not to roll over again and just doze off and spend a lot of time in this hazy state. But if you need 7, 8, 9 hours of sleep a night just to function normally and not to feel exhausted the whole time, obviously that is what your body needs and what your mind needs, and then I think that's fine. So the main issue is not indulging in this hindrance of sloth and torpor when you could actually be awake. And maybe try not to sleep too much during the day or something like that. That can be all very helpful. Otherwise, just to keep the body healthy and to keep the mind healthy, it's important to give the body and the mind the rest that they need. Whether that's 4 hours or 6 hours or 8 or 9 hours will be individual depending from person to person and from lifestyle to lifestyle. And people often notice that when they go on meditation retreats where it's very quiet and where there's not much stimulation from the outside world, they tend to need a lot less sleep than they would usually need. So a lot of the exhaustion that we feel and a lot of the sleep that we need is because of our very busy modern lifestyles. So the Buddha was talking in a different time, in a different place, and so we can't really follow this particular instruction too literally, I think. So someone called Faisy asks, how do we know that we are in a jhana state during our meditation? Well, obviously there are the jhana factors, lists of mental states that are present in when we are in a jhana. However, if we are unsure, then probably we were not in a jhana. So jhana states are quite profound states of meditation. And usually when we're in there, we will notice, because it is quite a special experience, especially the first few times that we are in there, when we don't really have mastery over the state and when it just happens. And we don't really exactly know how we did it yet, because we're not very proficient at attaining those states yet. So obviously, if we have the jhana factors, that might be one indication. And if there are no hindrances present in the mind. But also, it's not that important that we know the name of the state that we are in, as long as we know this was very profound samadhi, and that we are making progress on the path, and that we are clearing away hindrances. So that's much more important than actually knowing the specific name of that state and whether that was a preliminary state, or whether that was the first jhana or the fourth jhana or whatever. So I think that was the last question for today. So let's have a brief look at the rest of this sutta, so that we can wrap it up and start a new sutta next time. So once we have gone through the gradual training and become an arahant, then the Buddha points out that somebody who has attained this, that monastic, that bhikkhu, that practitioner, is able to endure cold and heat, hunger and thirst, contact with gadflies, mosquitoes, wind, the sun, and creeping things. They're able to endure ill-spoken, unwelcome words, and arisen bodily feelings that are painful, racking, sharp, piercing, disagreeable, distressing, and menacing to life. Being rid of all lust, hate, and delusion, purged of flaws, they are worthy of gifts, worthy of hospitality, worthy of offerings, worthy of reverential salutations, and an unsurpassed field of merit for the world. So obviously, once you are an arahant, you still have a body, you still live in the world until the end of this life. So as there's a human body, the human body is liable to all sorts of unpleasant sense experiences, because the 5 or 6 senses, or the 5 senses that are connected with the body, still work. So you can still come in contact with cold, heat, hunger, thirst, all the unpleasant bodily feelings, especially as a monastic, and especially in the Buddha's time back then, if you don't have money, and if you live a wandering lifestyle, not attached to any particular monastery or any particular abode. Obviously, you cannot carry all that many possessions with you. So in winter, you'll be cold. In summer, you'll be very hot. From time to time, since you don't store food, you're dependent on lay people. From time to time, you will not get enough food, so you feel hunger. From time to time, you will not encounter water in time, so you feel thirsty. So all these various bodily sensations will still be there. But obviously, since you don't have greed, hatred, and delusion in the mind, the bodily unpleasant feeling is there, but the mind is free, and the mind doesn't get into any kind of negativity because of that. The mind is entirely equanimous and entirely liberated from all these kind of fetters. And of course, the Buddha also talks about unwelcome, ill-spoken words, unpleasant speech that we all have to endure. People like to criticize each other. So this is just a normal occurrence in samsara. We always think that other people should be nice to us, but sometimes it's just the reality of life. Sometimes people are nice, sometimes people are not nice. And of course, the arahant doesn't make a big deal about this. He doesn't have any emotions involved with this. So if somebody is acts in an unpleasant way, they just let it go. They don't cling to this in any way. It just goes in through one ear, comes out the other, and they don't think about this anymore. It's just completely let go immediately. And the same way with bodily feelings that are painful. Obviously, since they still have a body, it can still get sick. It will definitely still age. So with old age come a lot of pains in the body, but the mind remains clear and equanimous and bright. and entirely unattached and entirely unaffected by all of these kinds of external impacts. And the Buddha says they are worthy of gifts and an unsurpassed field of merit for the world. So, since they are such a pure being, if people support them, then the merit they make is hugely much bigger than if they support a being that is not quite as highly developed. So the higher developed the being, obviously, the more merit you make. And this is sort of the highest stage, cannot be higher than an arahant unless you may be a Buddha. For that reason, this is the unsurpassed field of merit. And then the Buddha ties this sutta back in with his simile of the elephant that he talked about in the beginning. So Buddha says, just as if an elephant dies and the elephant is untamed, then whether he dies as a young elephant, a middle-aged elephant, or an old elephant, if he is untamed, he is considered somebody, an elephant that has died an untamed death. In the same way, if a monastic or a practitioner dies, whether young, middle-aged, or in old age, and they have not attained arahantship, then it is also considered that they have died an untamed death, because their mind still has defilements, so the mind isn't really tamed. But of course, if the elephant is tamed and it dies, it is considered to have died a tamed death. In the same way, for a practitioner or a monastic, whether young, middle-aged, or old, if they have attained arahantship, then that is considered somebody who has died a tamed death. And obviously, they have attained the highest, and they will enter Nibbana. And that is what the Blessed One said. The novice at Chiravata was satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's words. So that was the Dantabhūmi Sutta. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you liked especially the more unusual parts. I think they shed a very, very interesting light on the first jhana, on some of the questions that are discussed in modern times about the first jhana. Questions of whether you can feel the body, questions of whether there can be thinking in the first jhana, all these kind of things. So I hope it was interesting for you to see this somewhat unusual presentation of the gradual training. I hope this gave you some insights. And then for today, we will finish with 3 sadhus. Feel free to join me if you like. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And I wish you a good rest of the day. Have a good week, and I will see you next Tuesday. Bye-bye.